All right, welcome to the NYU Child Studies Center webinar series. Today's talk is, Are You a Pushover Parent? And my name is Tim Verduin. I'm the Clinical Director of the ADHD and Disruptive Behavior Disorder Service here at the Child Studies Center. And I'm going to be talking today about pushover parenting. And so the question of today's talk, Are you a pushover parent? Let's cut to the chase. The answer is yes, or you wouldn't be watching this webinar. Just kidding, actually, because the truth is that being a pushover parent, really, in the work that I do, I don't see a lot of pushover parents, because pushover parents don't dedicate the amount of energy and don't seek the kind of knowledge that you're looking for right now by watching this webinar. Pushover parents don't really know they're pushover parents, or they're not really worried about being pushover parents. Let's take a little bit of a look at the false dichotomy that people are often presented with when they think about this whole idea of whether you should be a strict parent or whether you should be a lenient parent. We're going to learn a little bit about how many different factors actually go into effective parenting and why being stricter is not necessarily the answer to get out of whatever dynamic you feel you might be into when you think you're being taken advantage of or you're not being strong enough. So the main thing that people think about when they think about whether they're going to be effective parents or not is how strict they're going to be. And they're worried for various reasons, maybe because of how you were brought up or because you may have a sibling or a friend who you feel is overly strict. Many parents are concerned that they will come across, if they're too strict, as being kind of a drill sergeant, or as being really argumentative or negative with their kids, and they really don't like that idea, and for various reasons are reacting against that. But at the same time, they're concerned about going too far the other way and begging and pleading and being kind of a sucker or a pushover with their kids. And a lot of times when we think about the right way to balance those things, we think, well, where's the happy medium between those two things? And the real problem with the way of thinking about that is that a lot of parenting research, decades of parenting research, has shown that this dimension of parenting, how strict you are, is not actually the most important dimension of parenting. It is important, and we're going to talk about how we can effectively set limits. But the truth is, when we look at different parenting styles, there is another dimension entirely that's actually even more important if you're thinking about good outcomes in your kids. And this is based on the work of somebody named Diana Baumrind, who took a very close look at different parenting styles. And this might actually even be familiar to some of you. On the top margin is the dimension of strictness, and what she called it was demandingness. And the question is, how demanding are you as a parent? You're either quite demanding or not so demanding, if we're going to split the world into two like that, right? But on the other margin is a much more important dimension, and that is how supportive you are as a parent. And the idea here is that if you look at those two dimensions and you put them together, you have four parenting types. Dr. Baumrind talked about three of them. She talked about the permissive parent, which is what we'll call the pushover parent for the sake of this talk, somebody who's relatively undemanding but is quite loving and supportive. And kids who have permissive parents, they turn out in various ways. Kids that don't have particularly difficult temperaments tend to turn out okay if they have permissive parents. Kids who have more difficult temperaments tend to have a harder time if they don't have a parent who's strong in setting limits. But a much worse outcome is on the other side of things, which is over here in the authoritarian quadrant. And this is that drill sergeant parent. If you're only looking at how demanding somebody is, then you would think that that was the antidote to being permissive. But the truth is, kids with authoritarian parents have parents who are very demanding but not very warm or supportive. And almost all the research shows that parents who are very authoritarian but not very warm and loving have kids that turn out worse. The worst quadrant, however, is this one over here, and that is parents who are neither particularly demanding nor are they particularly supportive of their kids. And those parents are called uninvolved parents. And that really is the worst set of outcomes, which leaves us with one of the four left. And that's right over here, this authoritarian or balanced parenting style, right? So the tricky part is, how do you manage to be both very demanding of your kids and very supporting? That's really the thing that needs to be achieved, and that is not particularly easy. And one of the reasons for that is, if you're thinking about increasing the amount of structure or how many expectations you have of your child, one of the things that you probably run up against is a lot of relationship problems. And one of the things we tell parents we work with is it's really important to try to start with the relationship whenever you're talking about trying to do a better job of setting limits. And one of the things I ask the parents I work with to think a great deal about is, oh, first there's this little joke. So there's actually a fifth type of parenting, according to Doug Savage, which is the evil cyborg parent. That would probably have the worst outcomes if it actually existed. So let's take a quick look at why we get stuck in this cycle, right? So we're talking about that the relationship is a really important thing to get right. But the problem is that if you have a good relationship with your kid when you're not asking them to do things, what you might often find is that when you go and make a demand, it's really hard to get that kid who you're just having fun with to do what they're supposed to do. They might initially ignore you, or they might outright refuse, right? And that kicks off something we call the coercive cycle of interactions. And I'll tell you in a moment why it's a cycle. Because when you look at this in toto, you might think, why would I ever want to do this? Or why does this keep happening, right? Well, the reason is because after that initial demand, when the child refuses, most parents do something pretty ineffective, and that is that we tend to escalate the situation. We think we're bigger, we're stronger, we know more words, and if we can show a little bravado or a little bit of authority, then the child will back down. And sometimes that works. But unfortunately, most of the time it doesn't. Because unfortunately, what often happens is that kids escalate right along with us. And although we can escalate with them to a certain extent and threaten or shout or even punish them, kids don't think as much about the future as we do. And so they can get to a level of escalation that we simply can't get to, right? And that's what we call a temper tantrum. Right? So at that point, most parents have noted that their children, especially young children, don't even seem to remember what the initial fight was about. And the amount of fuss that they're making is totally disproportionate to the kind of thing they've been asked to do. And at that point, it doesn't even seem like there's a rational discussion happening anymore. So what generally ends up happening is parents find some way to back off of that conflict because they just don't see any other way out of it. But when that happens, then we see why this all of a sudden becomes a cycle. Because when the parent backs off, the child and the parent settle down and return to their baseline level, right? Now that's really important because that's what creates the repetition of this cycle. What happens in that moment is after a point or a pattern of mutual escalation, there's this mutual reinforcement that happens. See, the child no longer has to do the thing that was demanded of them, and that's how they get reinforced. But the parent no longer has to deal with the tantrum, and that's how they get reinforced. So in the short term, this is something that keeps repeating over and over and over again. And most of the families that we work with find that they're not able to get out of that cycle because what they're trying to do is more of the thing that got them into it in the first place, which is escalation, right? So let's take a look at how we can get out of that cycle and how we can be more effective while still maintaining a warm relationship. And for that, we really need to think about the quality of the relationship that we have with the child. When we're asking children to do something, we need to bank on a certain amount of credit that we have with them, right? We need to take the good times that we have with them and we need to somehow leverage that into them doing things they really don't want to do that are really good for them, right? So one of the things I often ask the parents I work with is, what is your parenting credit score? What kind of credit do you have with your child that enables you to pivot to something where you need to be an authority figure? And these are the things we need to get right before we can really have a foundation from which to actually make things happen, right? And the things that I ask people to look for, frankly, are their own emotional triggers in parenting situations. We need to think pretty carefully about the things that make us less rational and more emotional. For me, it tends to be being late places, which doesn't really bode that well for me or my kids because frequently when we are getting late, I'd like to blame my kids, but the truth is I haven't necessarily done such a good job of preparing for the situation. So knowing that being late triggers me, I'm going to do a little bit more to think about how I can set up situations so that I don't get into that kind of problem. The other thing that we really need to be able to do if we want good credit with our kids is to show them how we can let go of a conflict and move on, not just with them, but with siblings or with a partner, right? We want kids to be able to move on and be flexible and not get stuck on something where we're holding a grudge. And if we have a part in that conflict, we also want to model for them the capacity to repair any sort of hurt that happened, to go back and make things right. This is an excellent way to build that credit, and it really gives us a lot of credibility with kids. The other thing we want to be careful of is, what do we say within kids' earshot? How do we characterize them to other people with respect to how much they're complying with what they need to do? We want to look for ways you can talk about the child positively within their earshot whenever possible. Further, what we really want to think about is when we promise that we're going to do something, or when we say just in 5 minutes, we have to be pretty careful about that, because what we're actually often getting upset with kids about when we feel we're being a pushover is when we tell them to do something and they say to us in 5 minutes and then they don't end up doing that. Modeling of that credibility and modeling good emotional control is really one of the most powerful methods we have of teaching kids how to act. So we want to be pretty careful that we're thinking pretty consistently about what message we're sending when we don't follow through, even with small things like sitting down and playing a game in the middle of our morning routine. Better to say you're not going to be able to do it now and not be too committed to when you can do that than to make a promise, or the perception of a promise more accurately, that you know you can't follow through with later. On that note, one of the first things that we tell pretty much every parent that we work with in the ADHD and behavior disorders service is that one of the curative elements of the treatment we do is scheduling and having regular special time together. Playing together, sitting on the rug and following your child's lead actually builds an incredible amount of credit, and it is much more likely that kids are going to be helpful 20, 30 minutes later if they've had a positive interaction with parents, right? Now, when you think about why that might be, think back to elementary school. Think back to that teacher that you had, and hopefully you had at least one, that was just so loving and so caring that you never wanted to get in trouble with that teacher. It's not necessarily because they were scary, it's because you had so much respect and admiration for that person. That carries the day much more when you talk about an authority figure being loving and admirable than somebody who's scary or somebody who's overly strict. You probably had one of those teachers too, and you might have behaved well when they were around, but you couldn't wait to get the better of them when they were out of the room, right? So we want to think very carefully about what kind of relationship elements might be undermining your ability to be more, follow through with more structure and more expectations. The relationship is really a very important foundation for that. So there are some other more practical things you can do if we talk about how you're going to approach a situation where you're going to have difficulty getting your child to comply. And the way we often talk about that is to think ahead of time about what it is you really want out of your child and whether they're actually capable of doing the thing that you expect of them, right? So if you tell your child who's 6 or 7 to clean their room and you go in there and you don't even know where you would start, then that's a pretty good recipe for setting them up to not comply and to, in fact, have a hard time doing what you told them to do. And what you're likely to end up doing at that point is what you later regret doing, which is to sit down and do a lot of it yourself, right? It would be better to start from the beginning thinking about what are the elements of that that you're willing to do and to begin doing them and then give a portion of that to your child, right? The other thing to think about is that when you are actually ready to give your child a command, that isn't necessarily when they need to do the thing that you're telling them to do. If you're telling a child in 5 minutes it's time to go and you're going to have to put your shoes on and then you don't remind them again, do not be surprised if when 5 minutes are up they don't go and do that themselves. That has left their conscious mind, right? But on the flip side of that, when you give an instruction to a child, you want to be very careful not to speak afterwards for about 5 seconds. One of the reasons for that is that a lot of the parents I work with will actually negotiate with themselves during that 5 minutes, and that's one of the reasons you later feel as though you're giving up some authority by making the command easier or by haranguing the kid to do it before they've even actually registered it or been able to get up and start moving toward doing the thing, right? The other thing that you want to be careful to do is if you're giving a child an expectation that needs a bit of explanation, you want to make sure you do that first, so that you don't get a case of the whys coming back at you after you give the instruction, right? So if you feel you need to give an instruction that does require a little bit of explanation, give the explanation. The last thing your kid should hear is what they need to do. That way, if they come back at you with why, you can deflect or ignore that because you know you've given a satisfactory explanation. If you forget to do that and the child does what they're supposed to do, it's just showing good respect to explain why you gave them the instruction later on. When you give those instructions, you want to make sure you're being as specific and clear as possible when you give those instructions. One of the main things that we see when we work initially with families who are having a really hard time exerting authority over their kids is that they tend to give instructions that are very vague. Let me give you an example of this. So we were teaching parents about the need to be very specific, and we were talking about how a lot of the commands we remember from childhood were very vague, like be careful, settle down, calm down, be good. And the dad we were working with started laughing. And he said, oh, that reminds me of when I was a kid. My dad told me that he used to say to me, behave, Junior, behave. And then one day I said, Dad, I don't know how to have. I'm being as have as I can. He actually had no idea what that word meant. So the dad the whole time thought he had a kid who was non-compliant, who was not listening to him. But the truth is, this was a kid who just didn't understand what was to be done, right? So we want to be as specific as possible. At very minimum, what you're doing is you're removing any shadow of doubt of what actually needs to be done. And if you're following these rules of setting up the expectation effectively, and your child is still not doing what they're supposed to do, well, then you have a pretty good sense that you're dealing with actual defiance, not confusion or an illusion of choice, right? The other thing we want to do before, particularly if you get into a lot of situations with your children where you feel that you need backup from your partner or you need to take a break for a while, you want to think through how you're going to have that happen ahead of time. If, for example, this is something you're going to tell your child to do, like put down a game that he's playing remotely with one of his friends and he always resists doing this, then you want to think about whether you actually want your partner in the room during that, just so that they can say, do what your dad says or do what your mom says, right? Otherwise, what might end up happening is you're going to look disempowered when you go look for that backup after failing initially, right? The other thing you want to think about is if you are going to need to come back with some form of leverage, whether you're offering some sort of positive reinforcement or whether you are actually dangling some kind of warning, you want to think about what you have in your arsenal to begin with. And really the best kind of situation you can be in is when the kid needs something out of you. So if your child needs something out of you, then you're actually holding more cards than they are. For example, if you're telling your child to get ready so that you can go to the store to get a birthday gift and then to the birthday party, then you're a lot more likely to get some mileage out of a technique known as when-then, where you say, when you have your shoes and jacket on, then we can leave for the toy store. And you might even actually want to put a conditional in there and say, if we're not able to leave in the next 5 minutes, we will be going to the party without a gift. If that's okay with you, that's okay with me, right? What we want to actually do in that kind of situation is leave the ball more in your child's court. Make it clear that they are the one expected to carry that particular task forward, right? If you're in a situation where you need something out of your child and your child doesn't need anything out of you, well, that's a much more difficult situation. So what I would generally say is if you're going to get more compliance, you want to try to create a situation as much as possible where your child stands to gain from complying. And that often means you want to look at the patterns of when you have the most difficulty. And frequently it's when your child is leaving something they want to do something that they don't want to do. And that's often a non-starter for most families. It can be much easier for you to change that context than to actually power your way through that kind of resistance. One of the final things I want to say on this slide is it's very tempting to actually use your emotion to actually change your child's behavior, to look like you're angrier than you are, or to get really emotional in the moment, or to say that you've had it, or even maybe to let yourself shed a few alligator tears if you're really feeling desperate. But that's actually not a great precedent to set, because one of the things we're trying to teach our children is not to coerce with emotion, right? In fact, you're going to also see that if you end up getting emotional, and that's the precursor to your child actually listening and doing what they're supposed to do, then you condition them to only listen when people are upset. And that's not an advantage that they're going to be carrying into other settings where maybe a teacher or a coach doesn't get that upset, right? We really want them to start listening to you when you're affecting this kind of quiet surety or inevitability of things happening the way that they should go. So let's take a look at some other things I would recommend, and then we're going to go on to a story from my own parenting, which I do like to share a lot with the families I work with, given the need for street credibility, right? So, but the idea here is when we break this cycle, we're going to do so much more so by thinking about the right mix of those dimensions we talked about at the very beginning of this webinar, right? So we want to keep the amount of love that you're showing, the support that you have turned up as much as you can, and you want to keep the snarkiness turned down as much as you can. So you want to try to precede demands with positive attention. Hey, thanks a lot for helping me set the table. It's dinner time, please sit down. As opposed to starting with, it's dinner time, please sit down. You hear how different that could sound, right? And you want to think about when you're giving an instruction to your child, how do you do so in a way that you would want your boss to do so to you? Do you want your boss coming in and interrupting a task, or do you want them to wait to see when you have a break and come in and talk to you then? To the extent that you can do the things that you'd like done for you, you want to do that for instructions, right? You want to notice every time your child's compliant and really try to tell them, hey, I appreciate you listening right away. And the other thing you want to do is you want to keep a close eye on what your child does to evade responsibility. The more you can identify those strategies, the more you can laugh up your sleeve when you actually see your child doing them. Don't laugh out loud. That would actually be pretty snarky. Don't pick up the rope when your child seems to want to do that tug of war with you. That's one of the things that leads to that escalation that is most likely going to end in you giving in. So I'm going to tell you one final anecdote. One thing that I think, before we take questions, one thing that I feel that is really important in this whole thing, and that is that, the job of parenting is teaching kids how, in many ways, it boils down to how they can do things they really don't want to do. That is really one of the clearest markers of success in adulthood, is the ability to do what you don't want to do and keep doing it until it's done. And that means being uncomfortable. That means giving up things that you really want. We have a swimming pool behind our building, and my 4-year-old son will swim in that swimming pool until his lips are blue and his teeth are chattering and he's burned more calories than he's consumed in 2 days. He would stay in that pool until it is no longer healthy. I know he's got to come out, but the other thing that I know is that he really doesn't want to come out. And the more that I can communicate that to him, the better. And I often think of this as an analogy that I can carry forward into the other parenting struggles I have, because this represents something I want you to think about in your own parenting, which is that when you know you are so right that you don't even really need to fight about it, right? You know that what you're doing, what you're telling your child to do, is so inherently healthy and good that you can spend a little bit of time understanding what it feels like to be on their side of things. So the example I often give is saying to your child something like, I know you want to stay. You're having so much fun. You're really sad that it's time to leave, right? And we can think about a way we could apply that validating statement to many different situations. To a child that wants to borrow the car right after they got their permit, right? So it could apply to any age range, or to somebody who wants to switch colleges for a second time, right? But the other piece of this, or I should say, and the other piece of this, is the ability to hold that feeling of validation in mind while also setting a limit. And that is the essence of authoritative parenting. So you say, no, you want to stay? Now it's dinner time. Please take my hand, right? And do not expect that if you're doing that analog for a child that age or older, that they're going to immediately and willingly do that. But when you do start to see some sign that the child is able to regulate themselves, you do want to give some attention to that. You're doing a really great job of calming down. The ability to do both of those things in the same moment is the essence of strong parenting. It would be a mistake to assume that just plain setting limits and holding to them is the whole job. It's not. That's not actually the thing that's going to lead to good, healthy interactions. All right, so now what I'd like to do, and hopefully you were submitting your questions. I forgot to remind you at the beginning. But now what I'd like to do is to address some of the questions that some of you had sent in during this webinar. And I'm going to take a look at the first one here. All right, so I'm going to read this out loud. My husband and I have different parenting styles. Is this confusing to our kids? And should we try to develop a more consistent mutual style? How would we go about doing that? So that's an excellent question, and it's one that comes up all the time. In fact, I would say more than half the time when I'm working with 2 or more caregivers, they have pretty different styles. The first thing that I want to suggest to you, though, is that they may not be as different in most cases as you think. And the reason for that is that we tend to overcompensate for each other's parenting, particularly around conflictual situations. And we tend to polarize. If you don't believe that, then think about the last time you were parenting your kid or kids when your partner was out of town or away for more than a few hours. Probably it went pretty smoothly, and probably you found yourself emulating elements of how they parent, right? And the reason that we polarize, though, is when we see our partner doing something that we don't quite agree with, we kind of swing the pendulum the other way. So the first thing I would recommend in an attempt to solve this problem is to think about the common ground you actually already have. And there's a pretty good chance that it's a lot more than how you differ. But in the areas that you do differ, there may be some wisdom for each of you to actually take away, right? And the way to do that is outside of the context of one of those conflicts. So one of you is going to have to stick your neck out, or maybe you can both do this. But one way to do that is to say, hey, I want to get better at that thing you're really good at. How do you think I could do that and still be me, right? If you feel you can get to that point with your spouse or your partner when you're not in the middle of a parenting conflict, that is likely to completely change the discourse. Because in my experience, when my own wife has said things like that to me, I suddenly want to be the best husband in the world, right? So that kind of disarming ability to kind of tap into somebody else's skill would be a really great way to start. Another question is, what can I do to reduce my child's time with video games? I can't get him to swim, bike, etc. Right, so this is, without question, the most common thing that parents come to us wanting to consult about. Nowadays, the video game time is really one of the things where you feel maybe you get pushed over the most, right? So the first thing I would actually ask you to do is to think about what you would like in your home, right? What balance of activities would you like to see? If you're not really sure of that and you want to do what's healthy, then I would look at the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines for electronics use. There's been a lot of research on this. It's not really as conclusive as we would like, but they do have some good recommendations for how much time kids should spend given their age, right? And once you've got those ideas in mind, you're going to get a lot more mileage out of actually getting the context of video game use under control than you're going to get out of, for instance, telling your child to do or not do something. And what I mean by that is, if you think about things that kids do pretty much every day during the school year, there's a remarkable number of things they don't want to do that they do anyway, like get up, brush their teeth, eat breakfast when they're not really hungry, and get to school largely on time. And if we think about why that happens, it's because it's a routine, right? And when things are routine, even if they're not pleasant, we do them because they're kind of automatic. You want to think about how you can set up video game use in your home so that it's automatic, so that there's pretty much a foregone conclusion that during these hours there are no screens, and that these things need to happen before screens can happen. That's a very good place to start. If you find that no matter what kind of structure you have in place, you still have conflicts with your child, the other thing to think about is whether there are any hardware solutions, ways of getting yourself out of that dialogue. One of them, and I don't have any stock in them, but I should because I recommend them so much, is a product by Disney called Circle, which allows you to turn on or off internet use according to preset guidelines per device in your home. So if you have a child who's playing a lot of Minecraft, you can tell them that Minecraft is allowed after homework for 1 hour, and when you turn it on, you don't need to turn it off. It turns off by itself. Those are ways of extricating yourself from that daily battle. So another question is, how is the parenting different when your child has a diagnosis of ADHD, and do you need to be more passive or authoritative? I would say that it obviously differs from child to child, but one of the things that we find in ADHD is that it is more up to the parent to be the executive functioning of their child as their child develops. And that means there needs to be more prompting, there need to be more routines, and there needs to be more positive feedback to actually allow learning to occur. So I would say the elements that I talked about in this talk, I would just dial them up a little bit more for kids with ADHD, including the positive, right? If anything, we want to dial down the amount of negative more because kids get a lot of negative feedback when they have problems with ADHD, and we don't want to be another way that that gets delivered to them, if at all possible. So the last question, when setting limits for my kids, my parents say I should be firmer and more expressive. For example, look angrier and raise my voice. This doesn't feel right. Are they right, or should they back off? Well, that's a lot of different questions, but let me answer one by one, all right? So the first thing is, yes, a lot of times people who are outside of the dynamic think that dialing up how strict or how angry you're going to be will be effective, right? But as we said, as I said at the beginning of the talk, it's generally more effective to be firm without looking angry. You can do that by knowing ahead of time what you need done and how you're going to say it, and by being clear on what's going to happen if it doesn't get followed, right? If you can surround that with a context of being positive and loving, which I'm sure feels more right to you than being angry and raising your voice, then that's much more likely to be effective, right? But I'll say this, because I get asked this question all the time about how to handle the well-meaning kind of remonstrances of parents and of in-laws, that the best way to actually get parents or grandparents to back off of the discipline is twofold. First of all, to say, I appreciate what you're telling me. If they're telling you in front of the child, to at least ask them to talk to you not in front of the child, because you can say, that's actually going to undermine my authority. I'd appreciate it if you not do that. You should model the same firm, even-handed way of setting that limit with your parents that you're supposed to be doing with your child, right? And the second thing is, once you find an effective way to handle something, do that as much as you can around your parents, because the best way to show them that you know what you're doing is to show them that you know what you're doing as opposed to talk about it, right? To model things like giving positive feedback, to model things like disengaging from a back and forth with a child. If you need to narrate that to your parents by saying something like, you know, this is that thing I was telling you about where when he starts arguing, I just act like I don't care, I'm not interested, so that they understand what you're doing and they know if they have an issue with it, they can talk to you later. All right? So listen, thanks very much for these great questions. And on behalf of the Child Study Center, thank you for joining me today. Once you leave the webinar, you're going to receive a survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you could complete that. You're also going to receive a follow-up email within a day or two with a link to a recording of today's webinar if you'd like to watch it again, which I hope you will, or to show it or pass it on to somebody else. We hope you can join us for our next webinar, which is Prenatal Parenting and Parenting Blues, What to Do If the Sadness Won't Go Away, which is on Tuesday, July 6th at 1:00 p.m. Thanks again. Goodbye.